When I was 21, I often found myself alone in my parents' house. This was back when I was still in college, and my parents were making more money than most people in the city. They owned several homes, so they were often away, leaving me by myself in a large house on the outskirts of town next to a small pond. Our house sat on a big plot of land, and there was a good distance between us and the neighbors. It was an upscale street where everyone had their own large estate. On the other side of the pond was a small city park, where I sometimes went when I had nothing else to do. That summer evening stayed with me for the rest of my life. I can't remember if it was a weekend or just an ordinary weekday. Maybe it was one of those dull weekdays when time doesn't seem to matter. I was sitting in my favorite room, the sunroom at the back of the house, where big windows let in plenty of light. It was the perfect spot for lounging, and the best part was the cool breeze that flowed through when I left the windows open. I had settled comfortably on the couch, watching some old TV show when I suddenly heard a splash in the water. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just geese or ducks occasionally squawking and splashing in the pond. But the sound continued. It wasn't a random splash. It was rhythmic, steady. It didn't sound like birds. I turned down the volume on the TV and listened closely. The sounds grew clearer. This wasn't birds splashing in the water. It was something or someone in the water. I stepped out into the backyard, turned on the patio lights, and stood there listening. The splashing stopped. For a few seconds, there was total silence, which made me feel uneasy. I wasn't scared enough to panic, but something about the situation was wrong. I decided to go back inside, lock the doors, and text my brother, just for peace of mind. Still, something didn't feel right. Then I heard it. Heavy breathing. It seemed to come from just outside, right behind the window. The sound made my blood run cold. My first instinct was to go check the doors and step outside with a knife for protection. As I made my way to the patio, I saw something that froze me in place. There were footprints, bare footprints, half dried on the ground. They weren't fresh, but they were recent enough to tell me that someone had been out there. And then I saw it. Something that made my heart nearly stop. A head appeared from under the patio. Just eyes and a forehead. Nothing else. The figure was hidden in the shadows, and then, all of a sudden, it was there staring directly at me. I stepped back, my body frozen with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, but I knew turning back inside wouldn't do me any good. I called the police, but nothing came of it. If it hadn't been for the footprints, if it hadn't been for that feeling of something lurking in the dark, no one would have believed my story. And even now, I can't say for certain what really happened that night. Looking back on that evening, I still can't understand what occurred. And the worst part is that question remains unanswered. Maybe I'll never find out what that thing was or why it was under my patio. When I was 21, I often stayed home alone. It wasn't because I didn't enjoy company, but because I got used to it. Living in a large house on the outskirts of the city, on a quiet street where you couldn't hear the sounds of city life, music, or the laughter of neighbors, was comforting in its own way, but also unnerving. At first, it was a kind of paradise. Fresh air, a beautiful pond in the yard, and the distance to the nearest neighbors who lived on large properties. My parents often went away on business, and I stayed alone. Of course, when I was still in college, this house felt like my own kingdom. And although there were many moments when I felt comfortable in my solitude, there were times when I could sense something changing within me. It wasn't physical silence that enveloped me, but a mental silence that slowly stole my ability to think clearly. One evening when my parents were away, I found myself alone again. It was an ordinary summer day, but the evening brought with it an unusual sense that something wasn't quite right. I sat in my favorite room at the back of the house, the sunroom with large windows that let in the breeze. The wind was always best at this time of year. The warmth of the summer evening mixed with the gentle breeze that kissed my skin, and I felt safe. After all, what could be frightening in the silence of a large house where everything seemed to be under control? It was one of those evenings when you blend into the surroundings. I sat on the couch, watching a show, barely noticing what was happening around me. But at the moment I decided to pay attention, I heard something. At first, a distant sound, undefined and faint. A splash. A splash coming from the pond, it seemed, distant but somehow drawing my attention. This wasn't the usual sound of ducks or geese, which I had grown used to. It was a sound more defined, as if it were calling for attention. Looking away from the TV screen, I focused on the sound of the water. It was like someone was moving through it, slowly but deliberately. My first instinct was to think it was just birds. That happened often, flocks of ducks and geese squabbling. But when the sound continued, I felt something inside me shift. I turned off the TV and leaned closer to the window. Silence filled the room, and then I heard it again. The water moved, but this time, there were no birds. It was something alive, alive but alien. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold shiver run through me. I stood up from my seat, quietly sneaking toward the door. Through the large window, I saw the pond's dim lighting barely illuminating the shore. There was no one there. I turned back toward the door, preparing to go back inside, but then I saw something that made me hesitate. Footprints, barefoot prints, leading from the pond to the house. They were strange, not fresh, partly dried, slightly blurred. The water had left its marks on the earth, but they didn't look like ordinary footprints. They were distant, like old memories, yet fresh, like a nightmarish vision. My heart raced, and I felt something inside warn me. This was a big mistake. I froze, stopped, but when I turned back around, I noticed a dark figure peeking from under the porch, only eyes and a forehead. But those eyes weren't human. They gleamed. The street lamp light created the illusion that the eyes were part of something hidden in the dark. Without fully understanding what I was doing, I pulled out my phone and quickly dialed the police. Nerves were shredded, my heart raced, and my hands trembled. I didn't know what to expect or what to do with what I had just seen. The police arrived. They searched the yard but found nothing. The footprints were gone. No one was under the porch. All the evidence seemed to vanish into thin air. Only I, with trembling hands and a heart that still couldn't find peace, stood there. I couldn't understand what it had been. And most importantly, why had it happened to me? It was a cool autumn evening when I first noticed the change. I was just 10 years old at the time, too young to understand the true weight of what I was about to experience, but old enough to feel that something wasn't right. Our house stood alone on the outskirts of town, nestled at the edge of a dense forest that stretched for miles in all directions. It was an imposing, weathered house, large enough that it felt like the kind of place where secrets could hide in corners and behind closed doors. The kind of house that seemed like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to come along and stir things up. My bedroom was in the far corner of the second floor, a small but cozy room with a window that overlooked the woods. From there, I could watch the trees sway in the wind, their branches twisting and curling like fingers reaching for something just beyond their grasp. At night, the shadows in the woods would grow long, and the house would creak in strange, unfamiliar ways. But the thing that comforted me, or so I thought at the time, was the nightlight. It cast a soft, red glow across the room, its light small and reassuring against the darkness that crept in from the window. I always left it on, the comforting glow, a silent guardian that watched over me as I drifted to sleep. It was the night the light first changed that things began to unravel. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sensation, like something was watching me. The room was the same, yet different. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was holding on to something, something that didn't belong. At first I thought I had just dreamed it all, but when I turned to look at my nightlight, my heart stopped. The soft red glow had shifted, just slightly, but enough to catch my eye. It wasn't the comforting crimson I had grown so used to. Now it was a sickly green, glowing like something ancient and decaying. It wasn't just the color, it was the feeling. I could swear that the light had a pulse, like it was breathing, waiting. I told myself it was nothing, that it was my imagination, that maybe it was the way the moonlight came through the window. But as I lay there wide-eyed and frozen in place, I knew something had changed. The room, the air, even the shadows seemed wrong. The next few days passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, The light never returned to its original hue, and it seemed to flicker more often. It was as though something was trying to get through the cracks, something trying to make itself known. But the worst was yet to come. It wasn't long after the light changed that I began hearing the sounds. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper in the night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the familiar creaks and groans of old wood. But it became more distinct over time. Soft, rustling sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the room. It wasn't the wind outside, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't even the house itself. No, these sounds came from the closet. Every night I would hear them. The sound of fabric moving, the faint scrape of something or someone shifting inside. I tried to ignore it. After all, what could be in there? Just clothes, shoes, my old baseball glove. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until I couldn't pretend it was nothing anymore. It was like something was trapped inside the closet, clawing at the walls, desperate to get out. One night I couldn't take it any longer. I called out to my parents, but they didn't answer. Maybe they didn't hear me, or maybe they didn't believe me. They had a way of brushing things off, telling me I was just imagining things. I remember my father's words exactly. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you, kid." But my mind wasn't playing tricks. I was wide awake, and the sound wasn't stopping. It was real. I had to do something. I waited until the next day when my father was home. I didn't want to go to him with just my fears, not until I had something concrete. I stood outside the closet, listening for any hint of movement inside, and then I heard it again, the faintest sound of fabric shifting. My heart pounded. "Dad," I said, trying to sound calm, "there's something in my closet." He looked at me as though I were speaking another language, but he agreed to check it out. More to appease me than anything else, I suppose. He opened the closet door, tossed aside the clothes and toys, and immediately began pulling everything out. "There's nothing here, kid, just your imagination." "Again," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I stood there, my pulse racing, trying to steady myself. But then something caught my eye. In the far corner of the closet, there was a small, jagged hole in the wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was as if the wall had been chipped away, a hole no larger than the palm of my hand. "Dad, look," I whispered, pointing. "What's that?" He knelt down, squinting his eyes as he examined it. His face turned pale, and for the first time since all of this had started, I saw genuine concern on his face. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "This wasn't here before." He moved aside some of the clothing to get a better look. The hole seemed to lead somewhere deeper, and I could hear the faintest breeze, as though something was moving behind the wall. My heart sank. "It looks like it goes outside," my father said, his voice shaking slightly. We both stared at the hole for a moment. I could see the edges of the passageway were worn, like someone or something had used it repeatedly. And then it hit me. The rustling sounds I'd heard at night weren't just the sounds of an old house settling. Number something had been coming through that hole, creeping into my room in the dark. I don't know what made me say it, but the words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. "Dad, do you think someone's been in my room at night?" He looked at me, confusion written across his face. "What are you talking about?" "I hear sounds from the closet every night. I think I think someone's been coming in." His face hardened and he looked at the hole again. Without saying another word, he stood up and started pulling furniture away from the wall, his eyes dark and focused. He began pulling at the edges of the hole, tearing away the plaster with his hands, his face twisted with anger. And that's when it happened. The wall gave way, and I could see into the passage, a dark tunnel that led somewhere deep into the house. My father didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight and crawled into the hole, the light flickering as he disappeared from sight. I stood frozen, my heart racing as I waited. Time seemed to stretch on forever, the silence growing thicker with every passing second. Finally, I heard him call out from the darkness. His voice was strained, distant. "Get your mother, now!" I didn't wait. I ran downstairs and grabbed my mother and brought her back upstairs. We stood together at the hole, our minds racing with fear and disbelief. My father crawled back out, his face pale and covered in sweat. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling. "Someone's been in here. There's a whole passage behind the walls. It leads outside." We moved out of the house that very night, leaving everything behind. My parents never spoke of it again, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We never returned, never even went back to collect our things. That night, as we drove away from the house, I looked back one last time. The house stood there, dark and looming, like a memory of something that would never leave me. And the sound of the rustling in the closet, it never stopped.